Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a very different sort of royal landscape, one filled with candlelit corridors, unpronounceable titles, and family trees that look, well, more like family circles. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle under the blankets, let your shoulders drop just a little, and let's begin our slow, meandering journey into the soft, slightly tragic world of Europe's most inbred monarchs, those fragile rulers who, through no fault of their own, were born into dynasties that believed the perfect marriage partner was the cousin they already had breakfast with. Because tonight, we're gliding through history's quiet corridors. The ones where power mixed with genetics in ways that, naturally, didn't always turn out well. Just let the day fade, and we'll start with a young man whose reign was less majestic command and more medical case study, the one and only Charles II of Spain. Let's drift gently into 17th century Spain. The atmosphere is dim, heavy with incense, and full of courtiers trying very hard not to make eye contact with their king, not because they didn't like him, but because they were trying to figure out whether he understood that they were there at all. Charles II, sometimes called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was the proud product of about 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. And when I say inbreeding, I don't mean the occasional cousin wedding here and there. I mean an entire dynasty treating marriage like a game of musical chairs. But with only 3 chairs, and all of them occupied by close relatives. Charles' inbreeding coefficient, the percentage of genes he inherited in matched pairs from the same ancestor, has been estimated at around 25%. For context, that's the same as the child of 2 siblings. Or, to put it more softly, Charles was genetically consistent, thorough, a sort of royal limited edition print. His jaw, as famously painted, protruded at an angle suggesting it was attempting to escape from the rest of his face. Eating was difficult, speaking was difficult, swallowing pretty much anything involving the basic mechanics of having a mouth presented challenges. Still, he tried very hard, but his body, as contemporaries whispered, seemed to have skipped several key steps in the functioning human checklist. He didn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak until he was, well, much later. And even then, speaking is perhaps a generous verb. Yet, despite these profound issues obvious to absolutely everyone, Charles was constantly described by courtiers as gentle, sweet-natured, and devoted, which is polite historical shorthand for he was doing his best, poor man, and none of this was his fault. Now, let's drift a little deeper into the strange, dimly lit world of the Habsburg court. A place where everyone was very proud of being related to everyone else, and where the family motto might as well have been, "Charlie, this time it will be fine." Charles' parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also first cousins. His great-grandparents, well, you get the idea. It was like a genetic hall of mirrors. This resulted not just in Charles' distinctive jawline, but a laundry list of medical issues that reads like a physician's anxiety dream. He had chronic infections. He had gastrointestinal problems. He had seizures. He had what polite records called developmental delays, which is history's gentle way of ignoring the screamingly obvious. He was also infertile, which, given the circumstances, was probably the kindest gift his body ever gave to the gene pool. Naturally, Despite this, the Spanish court married him off twice because no one loved ignoring medical reality quite like 17th century monarchies. His first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans, arrived in Spain full of French optimism and several trunks of beautiful dresses. She left the marriage. Well, she didn't leave it. She died at age 26 of what seems to have been severe gastrointestinal illness complicated by stress, depression, malnutrition, and living with Charles II. The court, in its usual sensitive manner, blamed poison, and then witchcraft, and then the French. But truly, it was likely just a young woman quietly collapsing under the weight of trying to keep Spain from falling apart while her husband attempted to rule, and occasionally remembered which way the throne room was. Let's just drift a little further now, into the soft political chaos surrounding Charles' final years. By his 30s, Charles was described as short, thin, and weak, which were the nicer phrases. Other accounts were less delicate. He can neither walk nor eat. He does not possess the strength to raise himself from a chair, and my personal favorite, he looks as if he has been dead for several days, which is hardly the most uplifting thing to hear about your reigning monarch. Naturally, the Spanish Empire was collapsing around him, but this was the 1600s, and so everyone politely pretended that everything was fine. The court even attempted exorcisms, plural, because of course they did. That's what you do when your king's body resembles a haunted marionette. Eventually, Charles died at 38, not unexpectedly, and Spain breathed a collective sigh of, not relief exactly, but the historical equivalent of thank you, fate, for putting an end to this long, deeply unfortunate chapter. His autopsy, which should never have been performed on someone so medically fragile, revealed a heart the size of a walnut, lungs corroded, a single testicle black as coal, and a body that, according to the attending doctors, did not contain a single drop of blood. An exaggeration, certainly, but one that tells you everything you need to know about how Europe viewed Charles in the end, as a tragic symbol of a dynasty that had pushed the limits of cousin marriage far beyond what nature had intended. Let's float gently now toward another monarch whose family tree looped back on itself like a confused garden hose, King Ferdinand I of Austria. Born in 1793, Ferdinand came into this world with a collection of medical challenges that made his eventual role as emperor obfuscated. He suffered from severe epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and a general frailty that made his life one long, medically supervised nap. His father, Emperor Francis II, was determined to secure the dynasty, and if that meant having children with his own niece, well, that was apparently just another Tuesday in the Habsburg household. Ferdinand, like Charles II before him, was therefore born with what we might gently call a very concentrated collection of family traits. He had the Habsburg jaw, he had the Habsburg forehead, and he had the Habsburg tendency to seize at inconvenient moments, which was spell always. He once suffered a seizure so intense during a state meeting that the officials simply paused the discussion, waited for him to finish, and then continued as though nothing had happened. Which really tells you everything you need to know about early 19th century bureaucratic etiquette. Yet despite his severe developmental issues, Ferdinand was crowned Emperor of Austria in 1835, not because he could rule. No, everyone agreed almost immediately that he could not, but he could sit still on a throne and occasionally hold a pen. And in the world of hereditary monarchy, those were apparently the only two job requirements. Real power, of course, was held by a council of ministers and, most famously, by Prince Met. Ferdinand was essentially the empire's sweet, fragile mascot, politely wheeled out on ceremonial occasions, gently cushioned and kept away from anything sharp. He tried his best. He really did. He once insisted enthusiastically that he be allowed to lead troops into battle. His handlers declined, kindly, firmly, and immediately. His most famous recorded quote comes from a moment when he was told he could not have apricot dumplings because apricots were out of season.
Ferdinand apparently responded in a burst of imperial authority, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings."
A sentence that historians still cherish, partly because it shows his childlike temperament, and partly because it sums up the Habsburg approach to governance surprisingly well. Around 1848, Europe erupted in revolutions. Ferdinand, understandably overwhelmed, abdicated the throne. He spent the rest of his life in quiet retirement, tending gardens and eating, presumably, as many dumplings as he pleased. He lived to the age of 80, to outlasting most of the people who had controlled his life. He died peacefully. And perhaps that is the smallest, softest victory in the whole tangled saga of Habsburg heredity. Let's ease our way back into the story. Settle in a little deeper. Let your breathing soften, and we'll float toward another dynasty that treated genetics like a friendly suggestion rather than a firm guideline. Tonight, we drift from the Habsburgs, who, let's be honest, are the Beyoncé of inbreeding, over to their quieter, slightly gloomier cousins, the Spanish Bourbons. Gasms, the Spanish Bourbons. No, we re-gliding toward the branch that produced a monarch who spent his life as a sort of royal metaphor for the dangers of ignoring basic biology. Because now it's time for the soft, unfortunate tale of Alfonso XII and XIII, and the quietly disastrous Bourbon bloodline that somehow made every generation just a little more fragile than the last. Let's start with King Alfonso XII, who entered the world in 1857 under circumstances so complicated and so deeply questionable that even Victorian gossip columnists raised their eyebrows. And Victorian gossip columnists raised their eyebrows at everything. They raised them at ankles, at women riding bicycles. But Alfonso's birth, that really got them going. You see, Alfonso's mother queen, Isabella II, was known for her lively social calendar. She had friends, she had companions, she had a husband who was, how do we put this delicately, not especially invested in the continuation of the royal line. Her consort, Francisco de Assis, was described by diplomats as effeminate, timid, and possessing manners more suited to embroidery than governance. One foreign ambassador delicately noted that Francisco had the voice of a 14-year-old girl. It's all very coded, very 19th century. So when Queen Isabella became pregnant multiple times, the question of paternity became a sort of national pastime. Newspapers whispered, court insiders whispered more loudly, and the Bourbon bloodline began to look like more of a Bourbon-dotted line. But whatever the truth, Alfonso XII became king, and to the relief of everyone, he was charming, sociable, healthy, moderately functional by royal standards. He even had the kind of face painters enjoyed because it actually had symmetrical features. Unfortunately, he also inherited a family tendency toward poor health and shorter than expected lifespans. He died of tuberculosis at 27, which, considering his family history, was practically But the real Bourbon medical oddities began with his son, Alfonso XIII, who started life dramatically by being born posthumously. His father was already dead, his mother was frantic, and the royal doctors were hovering with the nervous anticipation of men who knew that if this baby didn't survive, Spain's monarchy might collapse like a The infant king, yes, king from birth, was so tiny and sickly that they literally held him up to a window to reassure the waiting crowds that something resembling a baby had indeed emerged. For years he struggled with respiratory infections, fevers, and the general weakness that seemed built into the Bourbon operating system. Still, Alfonso XIII grew into adulthood, and then he made the single most unfortunate marriage decision available to him. He married a carrier of hemophilia, a disease famously spread through Queen Victoria's descendants. Now, hemophilia is a serious disorder in any family, where political pressure demands heir after heir. It becomes a quietly devastating crisis. Several of Alfonso's sons inherited the disease. Tiny bruises became life-threatening. Minor knocks turned into days of bleeding. The palace developed an entire protocol for bandaging the boys, padding furniture, and preventing even gentle tumbles. A normal childhood was out of the question. Running, forbidden. Climbing, absolutely not. Roughhousing, not unless one wished to spark an international incident. The princes were described as pale, gentle, and anxious children who learned too early that their bodies were fragile machines built without spare parts. The Bourbon bloodline had once again gently sabotaged itself. But while Spain struggled with its medically delicate royals, Central Europe was producing another family of questionable genetic choices, and so we drift back, softly, inevitably, to the Habsburgs. This time, to a man whose face launched 1,000 medical papers, Maximilian I of Mexico. A Habsburg prince through and through, Maximilian was charming, cultured, multilingual, and gifted with that classic Habsburg jaw structure, so prominent it could have held a diplomatic rank of its own. He grew up in the luxurious, tense atmosphere of the Austrian court under the rule of his older brother, Emperor Franz Joseph, who was the sort of man who believed emotions were optional and displays of affection were a breach of protocol. Maximilian, meanwhile, was sensitive, dreamy. He loved gardens. He loved poetry. He loved the idea of ruling, just preferably not in Austria, where everyone was annoyingly serious. So when Franz Napoleon III approached him with the deeply unwise proposal of becoming Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian said, "Oh, absolutely. What could go wrong? Well, everything could go wrong." It turns out that Mexico had not, in fact, asked for a European monarch, nor did it particularly want one. Nor was it especially interested in being told what to do by a man who had to carry his own special dentures because his Habsburg jaw made chewing inherently theatrical. But Maximilian believed with the pure optimism of a man whose entire family tree was essentially a warning sign. He and his wife Carlotta arrived in Mexico full of hope and Lee, to be met with civil war, political hostility, and uncomfortable humidity. Within months, Maximilian realized he had made a terrible mistake. Within a few years, that mistake became fatal. He was executed in 1867, a tragic end for a gentleman who probably should have stayed home tending roses. Carlotta, devastated, fell into severe mental illness, whispered about as yet another hereditary curse. She lived until 1927, believing at times that Maximilian was still alive and that European courts were conspiring against her. Soft tragedies, quiet suffering, dynastic choices echoing painfully through generations. Let's drift a little further now, but keep that breath soft, because we're floating toward the royal family often considered the genetic cautionary tale of Europe, the Russian Romanovs. Born in 1904 as the long-awaited male heir, Alexei was desperately wanted, so desperately that his existence felt like a miracle. But within weeks, the truth emerged. He had hemophilia, the severe, near-fatal type. Thanks to Queen Victoria, whose genetic legacy was stronger than any empire, hemophilia had entered the Romanov line. And it was here, in Alexei, that it reached its most dramatic expression. Any small injury, a fall, a bruise, even a firm handshake could cause bleeding that didn't stop. Internal hemorrhages left him screaming in pain, limbs swollen to twice their size. His parents lived in a permanent state of dread. His mother, Alexandra, grew consumed by guilt, and Nicholas, the Tsar, retreated further into denial. This constant medical crisis created a vacuum of fear, and into that vacuum stepped, gently, mysteriously, Grigory Rasputin, a wandering holy man, an alleged healer, a man with beard, hair, and hygiene choices that alarmed even the standards of early 20th century Russia. But Rasputin had one undeniable talent. When Alexei suffered, Rasputin could calm him. Maybe through hypnosis, maybe through reducing medication, maybe simply by encouraging Alexandra to relax. Either way, it worked just often enough to make the royal family believe he held mystical power. The more influence he had, the more the court panicked. The more the court panicked, the more Alexandra clung to him, and the more she clung, the more Nicholas refused to intervene. All of this traced back to one fragile child, one genetic mutation, one dynasty that couldn't escape the consequences of its own bloodline choices. Alexei's life was a quiet tragedy, not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but soft, lingering. A childhood lived under the constant whisper of mortality. Let's ease back into the story. Let your shoulders sink again. Let the edge of wakefulness soften a little more. Because now we're floating toward a royal family that loved pageantry, velvet, and extremely unfortunate genetic surprises. The British monarchy. They didn't have the dramatic jawlines of the Habsburgs, or the delicate hemophilic princes of the Bourbons. Well, actually, they did have those eventually. But they also had their own distinct catalogue of royal frailties, nervous conditions, mental instability, mystery illnesses, and of course, a few famously disastrous marriages. So tonight, we're drifting into the quiet, tragic, and sometimes unintentionally comedic world of Britain's fragile rulers. Let's start with a king whose name you already know, but whose story is much softer, sadder, and stranger when told slowly. King George III. George III is remembered rather unfairly as the king who went mad, which is not the most sympathetic historical shorthand, but it has stuck around with stubborn enthusiasm. He was born in 1738 into a Hanoverian dynasty that was, well, more German than British, more argumentative than affectionate, and more fascinated with arranged marriages than anyone should be. His parents were first cousins, naturally, and they raised George with the emotional warmth of a cold wooden banister. Still, George grew into a surprisingly earnest young man. He loved farming, he loved astronomy, he loved talking to trees, which, to be fair, was not considered strange at the time. He could be charming, gentle, endearingly awkward, and he was absolutely devoted to his wife, Charlotte. Unfortunately, he was also born into a family that carried a predisposition toward mental illness, bipolar disorder, perhaps, or a metabolic condition like porphyria. Historians still debate it. Doctors still sigh wistfully at the mystery of it. But whatever the cause, George's mind unraveled slowly, softly, and painfully over the course of his reign. He experienced bouts of mania that sent him into long, incoherent monologues, sometimes for hours. He became confused, agitated. He wrote letters to strangers. He talked faster than anyone could follow. He lost his ability to perform simple tasks. At one point, he reportedly shook hands with an oak tree because he believed it was the King of Prussia. Courtiers tried to hide it. Doctors attempted treatments that could generously be described as experimental and more realistically described as deeply unhelpful. He suffered, his family suffered, his kingdom quietly panicked. By the end of his life, George lived in a lonely, gentle, haze-blind, deaf, and mentally detached. His son ruled in his place as Prince Regent, while the old king wandered through memories only he could see. It's a soft tragedy, not the dramatic kind, just a man slowly losing himself while the world continued around him. Now, let us drift toward another royal whose life often reads like a case study in Never Marry Your First Cousin if you want genetically resilient heirs. Of course, I'm talking about Queen Victoria, the woman who single-handedly turned hemophilia into Europe's most fashionable royal disease. Victoria, as you may remember, married her first cousin, Prince Albert. But this wasn't unusual. Europe's monarchs treated marriage options like a buffet with only one item. They rarely married outside the family, and when they did, panic ensued. You're marrying a commoner. How dreadful. Do they even know which fork to use? So Victoria and Albert naturally stuck with tradition. They married each other in 1840, and by 1857 had produced 9 children, of whom they treated like carefully arranged diplomatic packages to be dispatched across Europe. Several of these children inherited hemophilia. One son, Leopold, suffered frequent bleeds and died at 30 after a minor fall. Several of Victoria's daughters carried the mutation into other royal houses. Before long, hemophilia had quietly slipped into the bloodlines of Russia, Spain, and Germany, where it complicated successions, shaped political decisions, and contributed to downfall after downfall. Victoria herself, of course, did not know she carried the G-naught, that she would have married any differently. She adored Albert, truly, deeply, in a way that may actually have been too much for healthy functioning. After he died at 42, Victoria essentially abandoned the concept of being seen by the public. She wore black for 40 years. She retreated from social life. She spent long hours brooding in darkened rooms, and she formed an attachment to a Scottish servant, John Brown, that made the court gasp, then whisper, then gasp again. Her grief shaped her entire reign, and her genes helped reshape the political future of Europe. We'll stay in Britain just a little longer, because we must drift toward a king whose life was defined not by illness, but by the deep, sleep-inducing melancholy of a man simply built wrong for monarchy. Edward VII. Victoria's eldest son spent his entire youth being told he was inadequate, too frivolous, too plump, too fond of parties, too interested in actresses and champagne, and well, anything fun at all. He was the heir, so naturally his parents suffocated him with criticism. When his father died after Edward had engaged in a mildly risque flirtation during military training, Victoria blamed him personally. Yes, she blamed her grieving teenage son for the sudden death of her husband. This did not help. Edward grew into adulthood, lonely, bored, and chronically anxious. He developed compulsive eating habits, compulsive socializing habits, a long-standing smoking routine that was basically a fire hazard, and a waistline that required custom-tailored uniforms with generous allowances. His health was fragile. Asthma, stomach problems, near-constant colds, and a face that always looked slightly overwhelmed, as if he'd just remembered he left something on the stove. When he finally became king at 59, he reigned only 9 years before dying of multiple strokes, the result of a lifetime of stress, overeating, and attempting to distract himself from the fact that he had never truly been allowed to grow up. Another soft tragedy, another royal body carved by pressure, another life defined by dynastic dysfunction. But Britain's most fragile royal child, and perhaps the saddest of all, was a boy named Prince John, youngest son of King George V. John was born in 1905. At first he appeared healthy, cheerful, bright-eyed, but by age 4 he began experiencing seizures, severe epilepsy that frightened his family and confused his doctors. He also showed signs of what we would now recognize as autism. He struggled with social cues. He became overwhelmed easily. He needed routine, quiet, and gentle care. This did not fit neatly into royal life, so the family quietly moved him to a small estate in the countryside, away from public view, with a dedicated governess. They loved him in their own distant, aristocratic way, but they hid him, because disability to royalty was something to be managed discreetly, something to be whispered about in corridors rather than spoken aloud. John lived a short, gentle life. He enjoyed the outdoors. He played with the children of estate workers. He laughed often. He adored his dog, and he died at age 13 after a massive seizure. His family mourned, briefly, politely, and then moved on, because the royal machine always moved on. John remains one of Britain's quietest royal tragedies, a child whose story was softened, blurred, and tucked away until long after his death. Now, take a slow breath, because we're about to drift away from Britain, toward a family whose relationship with genetics was so chaotic, so bewildering, that historians still sigh when they look at their family trees, softly, gently. We're drifting toward the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, a dynasty full of eccentricities, mental illnesses, reclusive princes, paranoid kings, and at least one monarch who believed he could talk to moonbeams. Let the room get a little quieter. Let the story take you by the hand again, softly, slowly, the way a tired breeze moves through an old palace corridor, because now we're drifting into Bavaria, a place of forests, mist, and royal families who treated sanity like an optional accessory. Tonight, we meet a dynasty whose genetic choices and emotional turbulence gave Europe some of its most fascinatingly fragile rulers, the Wittelsbachs. They weren't quite as inbred as the Habsburgs. Few people weren't, lest they were deliberately trying. But what they lacked in close cousin marriages, they made up for in hereditary mental illness, dramatic temperament, and the family history that reads like a long, exquisitely decorated psychiatric footnote. So let's drift into the soft, shimmering tragedy of one of the most celebrated members of this dynasty. A man beloved, misunderstood, and hopelessly unprepared for the job he inherited. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II entered the world in 1845, looking exactly like someone destined to spend their adult life building fairy tale castles with disastrous financial consequences. He was tall, dreamy, quiet, sensitive, more poet than prince, more moonbeam than monarch. His childhood was lonely, raised in Neuschwanstein's future shadow. His parents, King Maximilian II and Queen Marie, were strict in that famously aristocratic way that leaves children deeply introspective and quietly traumatized. They believed affection was something one demonstrated by occasionally gesturing vaguely in their child's direction from across a ballroom. Ludwig grew up finding comfort not in people, but in forests, swans, and mythology. He had imaginary friends for far longer than royal etiquette recommended. He also had a growing sense, perhaps inherited, that the real world was too harsh, too loud, and altogether too demanding. When he became king at 18, Bavaria collectively inhaled, hoping the young monarch would mature quickly. But Ludwig preferred solitude, nighttime walks, moonlit rides, and long, intense gazes into the distance that made courtiers deeply nervous. His ministers routinely found him wandering through the palace gardens in the dark, sometimes barefoot, sometimes humming to himself, sometimes staring at fountains as though waiting for them to answer him. It was, let's say, not an administration built on stability. As Ludwig aged, his eccentricities drifted slowly into obsession. He became infatuated with the music of Richard Wagner, the famously dramatic composer who was basically a one-man emotional thunderstorm. Ludwig funded Wagner obsessively, sending him large sums of money, writing him letters filled with poetic admiration, and occasionally rescuing him from creditors like a love-struck sponsor. The court whispered. The ministers panicked. Wagner flourished. Because who wouldn't he flourish with a devoted royal patron who believed you were the reincarnation of musical destiny? To distract himself from governance switch he disliked in a deep, bodily way, Ludwig began building castles. Not ordinary castles. No, these were vast, ornate structures based on fantasies, legends, and architectural dreams that would have bankrupted a small country. There was Neuschwanstein, perched on a mountain like a marble hallucination. There was Linderhof, his Versailles-inspired hideaway. There was Herrenchiemsee, a palace so expensive and impractical that even Ludwig eventually admitted he couldn't afford it. These projects grew, expanded, absorbed funds, and quietly nudged Bavaria to the brink of financial ruin. When ministers begged him to stop, he retreated further into fantasy. He began living almost exclusively at night. He dined alone. He staged elaborate operatic scenes in empty rooms. He flooded palace halls with candlelight. He avoided court audiences, paperwork, and anything involving taxes, which unfortunately was precisely what kings were supposed to handle. His isolation deepened, his mind frayed, and his family. The ever-watchful Wittelsbachs began whispering about inheritance, about madness, about what to do with a king who no longer seemed entirely attached to reality. In 1886, Ludwig's own ministers effectively staged a soft coup. They had a team of psychiatrists diagnose him with mental illness without ever examining him. A classic political maneuver, probably not in the medical textbooks. They declared him unfit to rule. They sent officials to detain him. Ludwig resisted, but gently, like a man who knew he had already been drifting away from the world for years. He was taken to Berg Castle under guard, and 2 days later he went on a walk with his personal physician. Both of them were found dead soon after floating in shallow water. No one knows what happened. A struggle, a tragic accident, a political assassination. Historians still tilt their heads at this one. But the softest, saddest interpretation is that Ludwig, already fragile, already unraveling, simply stepped too deep into the darkness he had been courting for years. He was only 40, and Bavaria was left with the world's most beautiful castles and the world's most haunting royal mystery. But Ludwig wasn't the only Wittelsbach whose mind loosened its grip on reality. The family had an entire collection of mentally fragile aristocrats, almost enough to fill a quiet psychiatric wing of their own. So let's drift toward one of Ludwig's cousins. A woman who was both brilliant and burdened by the family's recurring melancholy, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, more commonly known as Sisi. Sisi, Ludwig's cousin and sometime confidant, was born into Bavarian nobility with a temperament that made the Wittelsbach gene pool look positively theatrical. She was nervous, restless, romantic, and deeply allergic to imperial protocol. When she married Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria at 16, replacing her older sister as the intended bride, she found herself thrust into the stifling Austrian court, a court ruled with icy precision by her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who treated Sissy less like a daughter-in-law and more like a piece of inconvenient furniture. Sissy despised palace life. She despised being told what to do. She felt trapped emotionally, politically, and literally within the gilded walls of Vienna. So she fled, not officially, of course, but quietly. Repeatedly, she developed a habit of leaving for months at a time, traveling across Europe in search of fresh air, long walks, and places where she wasn't expected to curtsy at anything that moved. Her mental health deteriorated. Her diet became obsessive. Her exercise regime consumed hours each day. At times, she ate so little that her attendants feared she might disappear entirely. Sissy was, in many ways, a casualty of dynastic pressure, born into a family with a predisposition for sadness and thrust into a court that seemed designed to amplify it. Her life ended violently when an anarchist assassinated her in Geneva, but her story, like Look, is a softer tragedy than the history books often tell. A quiet unraveling of a woman who simply couldn't breathe under the weight of royalty. And yet another Wittelsbach deserves mention, a man who, unlike Ludwig or Sissi, slipped into mental illness with a tragic suddenness. Prince Otto, Ludwig II's younger brother. Otto began life relatively stable, if somewhat shy, but in his early 20s, after witnessing traumatic events during the Austro-Prussian War, he began exhibiting signs of severe psychological distress. He became paranoid, confused, agitated. He believed he was being hunted. He shouted at shadows. Doctors declared him insane, this time with actual examinations, and Otto spent the remainder of his life in quiet seclusion. He never ruled in any meaningful sense. He signed documents mechanically, under supervision, while his uncle served as regent. The Wittelsbach dynasty, for all its splendor, produced generation after generation of fragile minds, sorrowful hearts, and lives shaped more by their own inherited ghosts than by choice. Settle in, maybe pull the blanket a little higher, and let your shoulders sink. We're drifting now into the next quiet stretch of royal misadventure. Nothing urgent here, no need to stay sharply awake. Just a gentle meander through another branch of a family tree that frankly probably should have had fewer branches touching each other. We're returning to the Habsburgs, because of course we are. They're the historical gift that keeps on giving, mostly in the form of recessive traits and political crises and confused portraits. Tonight's next royal puzzle is Maximilian II of Austria, a man who by Habsburg standards was practically a modern wellness guru. He liked science, he liked plants, he liked thinking. It was all very suspicious, so let's drift into his world, where the court physicians were constantly hovering, where everyone was convinced he was about to die, and where he calmly refused to follow basically every Habsburg health tradition. Which, honestly, may be why he survived longer than expected. Drifting into Maximilian's childhood, Maximilian was born in 1527, right into the golden age of Habsburg nervousness. His father was Ferdinand, the first heir to the entire messy legacy of the dynasty. His uncle was Charles V, the overworked emperor who spent his life trying to manage Europe with the same exhausted energy as someone attempting to hold a cup of coffee, 2 leashes, and a grocery bag all at once. From infancy, little Maximilian was observed more closely than the royal treasury. Everything was documented. Doctors took notes, nurses whispered, astrologers hovered with charts, doing their best to improve morale, which mostly involved declaring that a great destiny awaited him as long as Mars stopped being difficult. He was sickly, because of course he was. He was a Habsburg. He had the usual combination of delicate constitution, a phrase meaning everything makes him tired and nervous, temperament meaning please don't talk loudly near the baby. You can picture him, thin, pale, with that unmistakable Habsburg lower face beginning to make its early debut, not yet dramatic, just a gentle foreshadowing. But unlike many of his relatives, Maximilian showed signs of a curious mind. He liked reading. He liked poking around plants. He liked asking questions that tutors weren't totally prepared to answer. This did not endear him to everyone, especially those who believed too much thinking could unbalance the humors. He was gently told to remain calm and not overburden the spirit. It didn't work. Maximilian kept learning anyway, a prince who actually liked reform. As Maximilian moved into his teenage years, he did something deeply upsetting to the older Habsburg generation. He started forming his own opinions. He admired reformist thinkers. He questioned certain church practices. He wondered aloud whether the empire really needed to fight all the wars it was fighting. This was the political equivalent of a teenager saying, "Maybe we don't need 12 chaperones at the school dance." Charles V, his uncle, was horrified. In the great Habsburg tradition of subtle and nuanced political parenting, Charles responded by separating Maximilian from many of his advisors, lecturing him frequently and reminding him that the family motto, if they'd ever made one, would probably be something like, "We don't do things differently." But Maximilian had a mind of his own, gentle, calm, earnest, but still his own, and that alone made him an anomaly. His marriage, a surprisingly functional union, let's drift softly into Maximilian's personal life now, where things, strangely, went a bit better than usual. He married Maria of Spain, his first cousin, naturally, but they actually liked each other, which, for this dynasty, was the equivalent of a miracle. Maria was gentle, reserved, extremely Catholic, and utterly committed to her husband. Maximilian adored her. He respected her deeply. He spent time with her, and not just in the sense of producing heirs, which, of course, they did. Frequently, in a world where royal marriages often resembled diplomatic hostage situations, Maximilian and Maria's partnership was almost romantic. Well, Habsburg romantic. Lots of quiet conversations, mutual respect, and shared anxieties about the children, and those children 15 in total. Because someone had to refill the dynastic gene pool, became a lineup of classic Habsburg heirs, some sickly, some stern, one or two with jaws that could qualify as architectural features. But they all survived long enough to be politically useful, which was the main thing. Maximilian II's rebellious health choices now. If you really want to see where Maximilian broke with tradition, look at his approach to health. You might expect a Habsburg ruler to enthusiastically follow the usual medical wisdom of the age: regular bloodletting, heavy purging, warm wine, cold feet, and herbs chosen by a court physician who probably read about them once in a 12th century manuscript. Maximilian did not care for any of it. He disliked bloodletting. He disliked purging. He disliked the constant insistence that baths were risky. He even enjoyed exercise, quiet walks, gentle movement, a little fresh air. For his family, this bordered on scandalous behavior. Ferdinand, I worried the boy might get ideas like health matters. And Maximilian, did he try to improve hygiene at court? He consulted physicians who believed in more modern approaches. He encouraged his children to avoid the more questionable treatments that had become Habsburg tradition. This probably prolonged his life, which shocked everyone. A calm emperor in a chaotic empire, Maximilian II eventually inherited the imperial crown, and he approached ruling with a quiet, careful energy. No sweeping declarations, no dramatic speeches, just gentle nudges, mild reforms, and the occasional polite disagreement with basically everyone. He admired tolerance. He thought, perhaps, Catholics and Protestants didn't need to tear each other apart over doctrine. He suggested that maybe dialogue wasn't the worst thing in the world. Both sides hated this, but Maximilian persisted in his own sleepy way, promoting moderation in an era that really preferred the theatrical. Over time, he became known as a peaceful emperor, which is a polite way of saying he didn't want to deal with the empire constantly exploding. Fair enough. The jaw, the genes, and the children, of course. we must address the genetics. Maximilian's children inherited a variety of family traits, particularly in the lower facial region. Some had prominent chins. Some had chins that entered a room before the rest of their skull. Some had more subtle versions, like gentle architectural suggestions. One child in particular, the future Emperor Rudolf II, inherited not just the Habsburg jaw, but also the Habsburg moodiness. He became one of the most melancholy rulers in European history. Maximilian spent years trying to prepare him for leadership, with the same energy a parent uses when trying to convince a teenager that homework matters. Rudolf ignored most of it, but that's a story for another part. For now, it's enough to note that Maximilian managed to produce a full generation of heirs, who were at least stable enough to keep the dynasty going, which, for the Habsburgs, counted as a rousing success. Illness returns. Because genetics always collect their debt in his later years, Maximilian's health began to decline. He'd always been fragile, but his habits had helped him coast along for decades. Eventually, however, the dynasty's long history of various ailments caught up. He suffered from chronic stomach issues, possibly stress, possibly both. He experienced episodes of weakness and fatigue that worried his court. He struggled with fevers and faint spells. But unlike many Habsburg rulers, he remained mentally clear until the end, calm, thoughtful, mildly exasperated with everyone. In 1576, during a particularly difficult illness, he was treated with the full lineup of traditional remedies, which he endured with all the enthusiasm of a man being forced to drink warm medicinal wine. He had specifically said he didn't tea, like the treatments didn't help. They never did, and Maximilian II passed away at 49. Young by modern standards, but practically ancient for a man whose family tree resembled a circle. His legacy, the Habsburg who tried his best. Maximilian's life wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with battles or conspiracies or theatrical scandals. He lived quietly. He ruled gently. He argued politely. He tried very hard to keep the empire from setting itself on fire. And in a dynasty filled with extremes warriors, tyrants, eccentrics, and people who believed hot baths caused moral decline, Maximilian stands out precisely because he was so normal. Well, Habsburg. Normal. He still believed in dynastic marriages between cousins. He still produced enough children to populate a moderately sized boarding school. He still struggled with the inherited health issues that haunted the family, but he tried, quietly, earnestly, consistently, and perhaps that's why he remains one of the more endearing Habsburgs, a man who looked at the centuries of familial chaos behind him, then sighed, straightened his uncomfortable collar, and attempted to do things slightly better. Not perfectly, just slightly, which, in royal history, is more impressive than it sounds. And now, with Maximilian gently tucked into history, let's drift toward the next figure in this long parade of dynastic oddities, someone whose reign was anything but calm. Someone whose portrait radiates stress, and someone who took the Habsburg habit of worrying to operatic levels. You can settle in again, shift the pillows just a little, and let the day fade out, because now we're drifting into the soft, slow-moving fog that is the life of Rudolf II, Maximilian's son, and one of the most quietly overwhelmed rulers in European history. If Maximilian was the calm, introverted gardener emperor, Rudolf was Privet. Well, the nervous museum curator emperor, the kind who keeps the lights dim, forgets meals, and jumps every time someone knocks on the door. He ruled a vast empire. He just didn't particularly enjoy ruling a vast empire, or ruling at all, or doing anything that involved being perceived in public. So let's ease our way into Rudolph's life. A reign defined by melancholy, magnificent art collections, alchemy, astrological consultations, political paralysis, and the gentle sound of courtiers sighing in hallways because the emperor refused to answer his mail. Just breathe in, breathe out, and drift with me into the soft gloom of Rudolph II's restless world. The early years, a childhood designed for anxiety, Rudolph was born in 1552, the eighth child of Maximilian II and Maria of Spain. He entered the world with excellent pedigree, impressive expectations, and the kind of genetic load-bearing jaw that hinted at Habsburg ancestry from several angles. He wasn't sickly, at least not more than usual for the dynasty. But he was sensitive, quiet, withdrawn. He preferred small, controlled environments and trusted few people beyond his immediate family. Naturally, this meant he was sent to Spain for political reasons. At the age of 11, Rudolph and his younger brother Ernest were dispatched to the court of their uncle, King Philip II of Spain, a man whose hobbies included paperwork, religious rigidity, and radiating an aura of solemn disapproval that could wilt crops. For Rudolph, the Spanish court was an experience somewhere between a boarding school and a monastery, except with more etiquette drills. Everything was formal. Everything was quiet. Everyone walked like they were carrying invisible bowls of water. It was an excellent training environment for someone who already had the emotional flexibility of a frightened house cat. He learned discipline. He learned protocol. He learned the importance of Catholic orthodoxy, and he also learned, quite thoroughly, how to suppress every feeling he'd ever had. This would go well later. Obviously, the Habsburg jaw meets Spanish stillness by his teens. Rudolph had developed the distinctive Habsburg profile, long face, a lower lip that seemed to be pondering mutiny, a chin that was both prominent and chronically unimpressed. Portraits of him from this era look like he's processing at least 4 simultaneous worries: a sense of impending doom, a fear of disappointing his father, a headache, and the suspicion that someone just moved his favorite quill without asking. This was, in many ways, peak adolescent Habsburg energy. His Spanish education trained him to conceal all emotion, which he did so effectively that, according to several observers, he barely reacted to anything happy occasion. Quiet nod, death in the family. Also a quiet nod, someone accidentally knocking over a priceless vase. Well, a slightly sharper nod. The Spanish court considered this maturity. Historians generally consider it foreshadowing. Becoming emperor, the role he did not apply for. When Rudolph succeeded his father in 1576, he became ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, king of Bohemia, and keeper of roughly half the political crises in Central Europe. He reacted by retreating inward like a turtle sensing a mild draft. Rudolph was not built for public life. He disliked meetings. He avoided speeches. He postponed decisions with the same consistency some people postpone dental appointments. He'd spend hours of Inns refusing to speak with ministers because he needed peace for contemplation, which was Rudolf speak for please go away. This didn't endear him to his more assertive relatives, nor to Europe, nor, frankly, to anyone who needed something done. The move to Prague, a soft, dreamlike escape, one of Rudolf's first decisions was to move the imperial court away from Vienna and establish his residence in Prague. Vienna was too busy, too formal, too full of people trying to talk to him. Prague, on the other hand, was atmospheric, foggy, artistic, and most importantly, easier to hide in. He transformed Prague Castle into a labyrinth of secluded rooms, private galleries, and chambers for quiet contemplation. It became a place where he could walk at night without being interrupted, a place where no one expected him to appear at banquets, a place where he could indulge his true passion, collecting absolutely everything, the art, the oddities, and the cabinet of curiosities. Rudolf II built one of the most extraordinary collections in European history. He adored paintings, sculptures, mechanical wonders, astronomical instruments, rare animals, fossils, strange bones, and, according to inventory lists, at least one stuffed lion that terrified visitors. His cabinet of curiosities was legendary, a mixture of museum, science lab, alchemical shrine, and mildly concerning hoarder's nest. He collected masterpieces by Archimboldo Bruegel Spranger. He also collected enormous crystals, unusual beetles, mysterious seashells, automatons shaped like fruit, and alchemical tools, whose purpose no one fully understood, including the alchemists. The collection became an extension of Rudolf's mind, brilliant, strange, disorganized, and full of objects that made courtiers whisper, "Please don't touch anything. We don't know what it does." Rudolf and the alchemists, a relaxing descent into pseudoscience. He loved astronomy. He loved mathematics. He also loved astrology, alchemy, mysticism, and anything that involved rare metals and glowing liquids. He sponsored alchemists by the dozen. Some were genuine experimenters. Most were very enthusiastic con artists. They gave him potions. They gave him predictions about the future. Every so often, they gave him a sample of something they claimed was close to the philosopher's stone, which usually turned out to be powdered brick fancy resin, or expensive nonsense. Rudolf believed many of them anyway. He wanted the world to be more magical than it was. It was one of his more endearing traits, even if it cost the imperial treasury the equivalent of several small castles. The decline when anxiety becomes a form of government. As Rudolf aged, the pressures of ruling built up like unread letters he absolutely did not want to open. His melancholia increased. He began avoiding people almost entirely. He cancelled appearances so often that ambassadors wondered whether he physically existed or was merely a voice that echoed through doorways. Some days he refused to get out of bed. Some days he refused to speak. Government fell into paralysis. The empire drifted like a boat whose captain is having a very low energy, existential crisis. His family began to worry. Then they began to scheme. Then they began to act. The brotherly coup. Matthias steps in. Rudolf's brother Matthias, more practical, less poetic, and considerably more willing to hold meetings, began maneuvering to take control. He pressed the estates. He gathered support. He pointed out, gently and then not so gently, that the emperor hadn't done anything productive since, well, a long time. Rudolph resisted in the mildest way possible by sulking, refusing to sign documents, and moving deeper into palace rooms. Eventually, Matthias forced his hand, pragmatic, decisive, very much the older sibling energy, despite being younger. Rudolph was compelled to surrender Hungary and Austria. Later, he was pressured into handing over Bohemia to people. Despite his fear, he held on to one last piece of power, the imperial title. But by then, it was little more than a decorative job description. The end. A quiet, lonely emperor, Rudolph II, died in 1612, alone, surrounded by his artworks, his curiosities, and a few confused servants who weren't entirely sure what half the items in his collection were supposed to be. He left behind an empire on the brink of the 30 Years' War, a treasury that had been drained by alchemists, a family that no longer trusted each other, and one of the most remarkable art collections ever assembled in Europe. But he also left something oddly beautiful. A legacy of creativity, imagination, and cultural splendor that outshines his political paralysis. Rudolph was not a good ruler. He was not decisive. He was not efficient, but he was a dreamer, a quiet soul in a loud age. And sometimes history has room for people like that, people who retreat into art when reality becomes too sharp. In a way, he was the gentlest of the Habsburgs. And also, the saddest, a man who ruled an empire from the shadows of his own mind. And now, let's drift onward toward another troubled figure shaped by dynasties, expectations, and unfortunate genetics. Someone who pushed the Habsburg inheritance to its breaking point, a monarch whose jawline became medically significant, a king who changed the course of European history simply by being born exactly the way his family made him. Tonight, we redrifting into the life of Charles VI of Spain, another member of Europe, a great genetic Jenga tower. A man who spent most of his reign being politely ignored by fate, overshadowed by more dramatic relatives, and wandering through palaces that were, more often than not, slightly too cold and slightly too wet for comfort. So, let's drift in. Charles VI belongs to that Lytira Habsburg branch that historians like to gesture at with long sighs. He was born in 1685, during the period when the Habsburg family tree had stopped branching and had started looping. As a result, Charles emerged into the world with the usual Habsburg biological starter pack, a strong sense of dynasty, a slightly precarious immune system, and a jaw that made portrait artists contemplate new brush techniques. He wasn't nearly as medically tragic as his brother, the famous Charles II of Spain, who was essentially a collection of symptoms inside a velvet coat, but the bar was low. Charles VI cleared it by existing without collapsing. Admirable. Really. He spent his early childhood drifting between palaces filled with drafty hallways, cold stone floors, and the general aesthetic of cathedral that also hosts dinner parties. Spanish royal households in the late 17th century specialized in two things: formality and mild discomfort. Charles absorbed both. Let's float for a moment across the centuries to those sprawling palaces, especially. Imagine miles of echoing corridors, court officials gliding around in black attire, and the ever-present scent of incense drifting through stairwells. A place so somber that even the chandeliers felt like they needed counseling. Young Charles learned early that he was important, not because he felt particularly talented. He was average in almost everything, but because everyone kept telling him so. He was a Habsburg, and therefore destined for one of three things: ruling, marrying a cousin, or dying. Young Charles did all three, if you stretch the definitions. As a youth, Charles was, in the gentle phrasing of one court observer, quiet, diligent, and noticeably pale. A perfect resume for a European prince. He practiced languages, studied political theory in that very detached, princely way that suggests someone is reading words without truly registering them. And he tried to master court etiquette. The problem with court etiquette was that it was deeply boring. Every gesture was symbolic. Every phrase was rehearsed. Every bow had the emotional weight of wet wallpaper. Charles, like many princes who came before him, found solace in hunting. But unlike the grand, vigorous royal hunts we imagine for pelts, roaring fires, barrels of wine hiss were often subdued affairs. Charles preferred small game, rabbits, partridges, occasionally a fox, if he felt adventurous. The image of a Habsburg prince quietly stalking a rabbit through the mist is, well, very on brand. Now, for the big twist though, we'll keep it pleasantly dull. Charles the Sixth was never supposed to become emperor. He was destined for Spain. Even as a child, plans were sketched out for him to inherit the Spanish crown if his brother Charles II died without heirs. And since Charles II, the ability to produce heirs hovered somewhere between unlikely and medically improbable, everyone assumed young Charles VI would get the job. So imagine him growing up with that in mind, studying Spanish politics, practicing the language, preparing to rule a kingdom that had more colonies than functioning banks, all while living in palaces chilled by drafts that behaved like minor weather systems. It was a long apprenticeship, a gentle one, but a persistent one. And then Charles II died in 1700, as expected. But Europe, always eager to complicate things, decided to have a multi-decade meltdown about it. We drift now into the War of the Spanish Succession. Don't worry, we'll keep it soothing. No cannon fire, just the soft rustling of treaties and the faint whine of diplomats complaining into their sleeves. When Charles II died, he named Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV, as heir. This upset everyone who wasn't France. Allowing the Bourbon and Habsburg houses to merge crowns was considered a cosmic imbalance, the political equivalent of putting two magnets too close together. So Europe split into factions. France supported Philip, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and roughly half of everyone else supported Charles VI. And thus, wars happened. But here's the thing, Charles VI was not a warrior. He traveled to Spain to claim the throne, but he did it reluctantly, almost apologetically. He preferred libraries, hunting rabbits, talking quietly in council chambers, being emperor material, not war material. Still, he went, he smiled, he waved, he accepted glasses of wine from various city councils, and he pretended with great effort that he liked public ceremonies. The war dragged on. Europe groaned, armies marched, and Charles VI spent much of his time waiting in slightly damp Spanish palaces for news that never seemed particularly good. Then, Unexpectedly, in 1711, Charles's older brother Joseph I died. This made Charles the new Holy Roman Emperor, which suddenly meant that he couldn't rule Spain as well, not because he couldn't physically manage to crowns, but because Europe would not allow that level of political imbalance. They had barely tolerated him ruling Spain alone. So Charles left Spain. Yes, after all that, he packed up and went home, leaving Spain to the Bourbons and resuming his Habsburg duties in Austria. Imagine the frustration. Years of war, months of ceremonies, countless uncomfortable chairs, and all for nothing. But Charles accepted it with that classic Habsburg resignation that comes from generations of being told you important, while life repeatedly proves otherwise. Now we drift to Vienna, where Charles VI spent the rest of his reign. He became a surprisingly capable emperor, quiet, thoughtful, and bureaucratically inclined. He wasn't charismatic, but he was steady. He loved systems and neatness and consistency. His greatest personal joy was building the Schönbrunn Palace into something far grander than its original form, a place with gardens, galleries, and the aesthetic of imperial relaxation, which is to say, still beautiful, still majestic, but a little stiff around the edges. Charles could often be found walking those gardens, hands behind his back, thinking in that slow, careful way he had, probably wondering why life kept redirecting him like a carriage with a wobbly wheel. He married Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, an elegant, warm, and infinitely patient woman who deserved a husband with slightly more enthusiasm. Charles cared for her, but in a muted, chronically distracted way. They wanted a son, naturally. Dynasties always do. But life, in its ongoing effort to tease the Habsburgs, refused. They had daughters, precious ones, but no sons, and every year that passed made Europe a little more nervous. Which leads us into Charles VI's great obsession, the Pragmatic Sanction, a document that declared his daughter Maria Theresa the rightful heir to his lands. Charles spent decades convincing other rulers to agree to this. He poured money into diplomacy. He traded favors. He hosted banquets he didn't enjoy. And almost everyone signed. Smiles all around. Treaties sealed. Promises made. And then, when Charles VI died in 1740, nearly every major power immediately tore up those promises and invaded. The War of Austrian Succession began because Europe simply could not resist a dynastic crisis. It was their favorite hobby. Charles VI died after eating a plate of mushrooms that were either poorly cooked or simply his final misfortune. Historians still debate it. Either way, he exited quietly, leaving his daughter, Maria Theresa, to face a storm he had spent a lifetime trying to prevent. So, what do we make of Charles VI? A man who prepared for Spain but ruled Austria. A man who wanted order but lived in an era of chaos. A man who built palaces, signed treaties, and hoped sincerely that the world would remain stable after he was gone. It did not, but the attempt was admirable. And so, we let Charles VI drift back into the soft fog of history. A quiet emperor in a noisy century. A thoughtful man in a dynasty better known for its jawlines than its introspection. Settle in. Stretch your shoulders. Let your breathing slow a little, like a royal courier finally allowed to get off his horse after a very long, very pointless diplomatic sprint. Tonight, we drift into the life of Maria Theresa, daughter of the recently departed Charles VI, and frankly, the only Habsburg who ever managed to look like she knew what she was doing. Even if, behind the portraits and palace walls, she was subsisting on a diet of stress, stubbornness, and the vague hope that sleep was optional. We won't rush. We'll just float through her reign the way she floated through her responsibilities weighted by several empires, 16 children, and a husband who preferred partying to governing. Let's drift in. Maria Theresa was born in 1717, a time when the Habsburg Empire still imagined itself powerful and coordinated, sort of like a grandiose ship held together with ribbons, tradition, and the political equivalent of chewing gum. Her birth was celebrated lavishly. Bells rang, courtiers cheered. Diplomats toasted the future of the dynasty, which is something dynasties always say, even when the newborn in question is still shaped vaguely like a loaf of bread. She grew up in the Hofburg Palace, surrounded by marble perfumed halls, stiff ceremonial gowns, uncomfortable furniture, and the constant murmur of ministers trying to look calm while quietly panicking. Maria Theresa was bright, curious, and energetic, three traits that immediately clashed with the environment she was raised in. The Habsburg court preferred children to be decorative, fragile, and slightly melancholy. Maria Theresa, in contrast, wanted to ride horses, debate politics, explore gardens, and tragically understand things. Despite the best efforts of etiquette tutors, she was never fully subdued. Now we drift toward her adolescence. Imagine candlelit lessons in Chile rooms, stacks of treaties, maps of territories nobody could actually find on foot, and tutors gently explaining why the dynasty owned certain places because it always has, or because someone married someone else in 1485. Maria Theresa absorbed all of it. She had a good head for politics, even though she wasn't expected to use it. After all, she wasn't supposed to inherit anything. She was just a valuable bargaining chip in the international marriage market. And then her older brother died, and then another brother died, and then her father realized at the pace of a very slow wagon that she was his only surviving legitimate child. This began the long campaign to secure her right to inherit, the pragmatic sanction. Endless negotiations, treaties signed with suspiciously warm smiles. Promises made by kings who fully intended to ignore them later. Maria Theresa, still a teenager, watched diplomats swirl around her like worried insects, all buzzing about her future while she silently hoped she might have time for normal hobbies someday. Spoiler, she would not. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, a man who was charming, cheerful, attractive, and politically, let's say, relaxed. He adored Maria Theresa. She adored him. It was by royal standards an astonishingly functional marriage. But Francis Stephen had one major flaw. He had absolutely no interest in helping her run the empire she would soon inherit. He preferred parties, and food, and card games, and long evenings of wine-fueled conversation in salons where people said witty things that meant nothing. He was the kind of man who would schedule an urgent council meeting and then forget to attend because someone offered him cake. Maria Theresa tolerated this in the way an exhausted mother tolerates a toddler, lovingly, but with a gradually deepening sigh. Then came 1740. Her father, Charles VI, died, and at the exact moment the court began mourning, Europe immediately began misbehaving. Nearly every major power that had promised to support her succession decided quite suddenly that actually No, they didn't feel like it. Why? Because they assumed she would be weak, because she was young, because she was female, and because, frankly, Europe had been waiting decades for an excuse to steal things, and thus began the War of the Austrian Succession. Don't worry, we'll keep it tranquil. Think of it as a slow-moving storm. Lots of political thunder, soft diplomatic rainfall. Occasionally, a lightning bolt of betrayal, but we'll drift through it gently. Maria Theresa had barely taken the throne before Bavaria claimed Austria, Prussia claimed Silesia, France claimed the Rhineland, Saxony claimed anything that wasn't nailed down. It was like a yard sale that nobody asked her permission to host. And in the middle of this chaos, Maria Theresa was pregnant. Of course she was. Habsburg queens were always pregnant. It was practically the job description. Picture her, a 23-year-old woman in a silk gown, crown slightly askew, standing at the center of a territorial feeding frenzy while trying to breathe normally for the sake of the baby. But despite all this, she remained composed, determined, more awake than anyone who had recently given birth should reasonably be. And most importantly, she didn't give up a single territory without a fight. Maria Theresa wasn't a military strategist, but she had something almost better, a stubborn refusal to collapse. She rallied troops, reformed administration, appealed to her subjects for loyalty, and made speeches that were surprisingly rousing for someone who spent most of her days under layers of brocade. One famous moment softly recounted by later historians, because even heroic scenes sound more soothing at a whisper curd. When she appeared before the Hungarian Diet holding her infant son, she asked for support. She promised to defend their liberties. She looked exhausted, but unbreakable. The Hungarians, moved by the sight of a weary young queen clutching a baby while half of Europe tried to mug her, offered their loyalty and support. It was one of the few acts of political kindness she received in her early reign. Now, let's drift into the domestic sphere, which was not restful either. Maria Theresa produced 16 children. 16, as in one short of 17. The palace corridors echoed for decades with the sound of tiny aristocratic footsteps and the distant wailing of toddlers who didn't want to learn etiquette. Her children grew into a mix of competent rulers, anxious intellectuals, chronically unhappy princesses, and one Marie Antoinette, who lived her own dramatic opera later on. Maria Theresa loved them fiercely, but she was also strict and controlling, and deeply convinced that she alone knew what was best. Her daughters were married off strategically. Her sons were assigned positions with clinical efficiency. Maria Theresa micromanaged everything: military reform, court etiquette, tax policy, her children's marriages, and occasionally the color of upholstery in various palaces. She is, perhaps, the only empress in history who tried to personally reorganize the imperial post office. Death followed her often. Political losses, financial strains, and the creeping awareness that Europe was becoming too modern, too enlightened, too quick for her old-world instincts. She fought against certain reforms even as she introduced others. She modernized the state but distrusted philosophers. She improved education but disliked religious toleration. She wanted progress, but she wanted it slowly, politely, and preferably without upsetting the furniture. Her life was one long balancing act between tradition and necessity. And yet, despite everything, wars, pregnancies, paperwork, palace drafts, and the eternal burden of ruling a dynasty that had peaked 3 generations earlier, Maria Theresa endured, not gracefully, but steadfastly. She grew older, heavier, wearier. She wrapped herself in layers of lace and fur. She sat in council chambers with an expression that suggested she had become immune to both surprises and nonsense. And still, she ruled. Her husband, Francis Stephen, eventually died after a lifetime of contributing little but affection and social charm. Maria Theresa never stopped grieving him. She wore widow's black for the rest of her life and kept his rooms exactly as they were. She would wander them at night, quietly, softly, like a shadow wrapped in silk, thinking, remembering, sighing, letting the weight of history settle over her like a heavy quilt. Maria Theresa died in 1780, a deeply tired woman who had held an empire together with sheer determination. She passed the crown to her son Joseph II, who immediately began doing everything she had told him not to do. Such is the cycle of dynasties. So we let Maria Theresa drift into the gentle dusk of memory. The last great Habsburg, a mother to her people, a mother to 16 actual children, and a ruler who never once got enough sleep. Breathe. Let it settle. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward to the next figure in this long, winding royal dreamscape.